Imagine discovering your father used your professional reputation as a shield for his $1 million debts, only for him to text you, "Don't contact us again." He thought he silenced her, but he didn't realize he just gave a forensic investigator the green light to tear his empire down by Friday's sunset. I hope you're all having a peaceful week. How is the weather where you are? Are you staying warm? Please let me know in the comments. I truly love hearing about your day. Today, I want to tell you about Eleanor, a woman who realized that sometimes being cut off is the greatest gift of freedom you could ever receive. Let's listen as Eleanor takes us through the ledger of her life. It was 11:45 at night, a time when most people in Connecticut were tucked away in their expensive linens. But for a forensic accountant, the night is when the numbers finally stop moving and start telling the truth. My phone vibrated against the glass surface, a sharp, aggressive buzz that felt like a warning. It was a voicemail from my father, Richard Vance. I didn't have to listen to it to know the tone, but I pressed play anyway, leaning back into my chair as his voice filled the silent room. "Eleanor, don't bother coming to the brunch on Sunday," his voice boomed, dripping with that practiced Ivy League arrogance that had charmed banks out of millions for 3 decades. There was no hello, no how are you, just the cold, surgical strike of a man who viewed people as assets to be depreciated. "I've had enough of your constant prying, your endless questions about the firm's liquidity, and that insufferable habit you have of looking at me like I'm one of your audit subjects. You've forgotten your place. You were a daughter first, but you've chosen to be a spy. Consider yourself officially severing your name from your family, cut off from the Vance name and the estate. Don't call your mother, don't call Vanessa, and for heaven's sake, stop looking into my accounts. You're done, Eleanor. Goodbye." The line went dead with a final, dismissive click. I sat there in the dark for a long time, the silence of the abyss settling over me like a familiar coat. Most daughters would be in tears, their world shattered by the ultimate rejection of a parent. But I am not most daughters. I am a woman who spent 10,000 hours learning how to find the rot hidden behind gold-leafed frames and offshore shell companies. As I replayed the message in my mind, a small, chilling smile touched my lips. Richard thought he was punishing me, exercising the same patriarchal power he had used to bully boardrooms since the 1980s. He didn't realize that by cutting me out, he had just severed the only thread holding his fragile, debt-ridden empire together. My father has always been a man of grand gestures and empty pockets. He lives his life in the gap between what he has and what he wants people to think he has. For the last 5 years, I have been the invisible hand smoothing over his clerical errors, the one who quietly fixed the discrepancies in his asset verifications so the banks wouldn't come knocking. I did it out of a misguided sense of family legacy, a belief that the Vance name was something worth protecting. But as the red light on my phone blinked, signaling the end of our relationship, I realized that a legacy built on lies is just a prison for the truth teller. He called me prying because I saw the $30 million hole in his latest real estate development. He called me insufferable because I knew his signature on the latest loan application was a desperate forgery. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the twinkling lights of the city. Richard Vance believes in the American dream of the self-made man, but he forgot the most important rule of the game. You never fire the person who knows where the bodies are buried. He thinks he has stripped me of my status, my inheritance, and my home. He doesn't understand that to a forensic accountant, those are just line items that can be reclassified. My value doesn't come from his signature. It comes from my certification. I felt a surge of cold, professional clarity wash away the lingering sting of his betrayal. The emotions were a distraction. The data was the weapon. He wants me to be gone? Fine. I will be the ghost that haunts his balance sheets. He thinks he has protected his secrets by exiling the one person who cared enough to hide them. He is a man standing on a glass floor, throwing stones at the person holding the safety net. Tomorrow, the banks will receive my updated professional disclosures. Tomorrow, the investigative part of my job description will finally be applied to the man who gave me my name. I turned back to my desk, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, ready to begin the audit of a lifetime. He thinks he just fired a daughter. He actually just lost his only shield. As I stood there, the city lights reflecting in the window glass, my mind drifted back to last Saturday at the family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The Vance Mansion is a masterclass in the gilded cage aesthetic, all white stone facades, manicured boxwood hedges, and a driveway so long it feels like an audition for a life you can't afford. To the outside world, it is the pinnacle of the American dream, the reward for 40 years of Richard Vance's supposed brilliance. But as a woman who spends her days looking at the skeletal remains of bankrupt companies, I couldn't help but see the cracks in the mortar. I remember walking through the foyer, the air thick with the scent of expensive lilies and desperation, feeling like a stranger in the very halls where I grew up. Dinner that night was a performance worthy of a Broadway stage. Richard sat at the head of the table, swirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux that probably cost more than a month's rent for my first apartment. He was in his element, holding court about his latest game changer, a multi-million-dollar luxury development project that he claimed would redefine the coastline. His voice had that patronizing, booming quality he uses when he wants to drown out the sound of his own shrinking bank accounts. "It's about vision, Eleanor," he had said, pointing his silver fork at me as if I were a disobedient student. "While you're busy counting pennies and looking for rounding errors, I'm building a legacy for this family." I remember looking at my mother, Lillian, who sat draped in silk at the other end of the table. She is a woman who has turned not knowing into an art form. Whenever I tried to steer the conversation toward the reality of the firm's liquidity or the mounting interest on their bridge loans, she would let out a soft, rehearsed sigh and press a delicate hand to her forehead. "Oh, Eleanor, not tonight," she would murmur, her voice fluttering like a wounded bird. "I have such a migraine, and your father has worked so hard. Can't we just enjoy the success for once?" It was her signal to stop the audit, to let the fantasy continue for another hour. It was a silent pact between them. He would provide the illusion of wealth, and she would provide the audience of one. The irony of it all was that even then, I could see the rot. I noticed the way the silver wasn't quite as polished as it used to be, and how the third-floor guest wing had been shut off to save on heating, a phrase that is old money code for "we can't pay the utility bill." My father would brag about his private jet access while I knew, through my own professional channels, that his membership had been suspended for non-payment 3 months prior. He was a man drowning in the middle of a desert, trying to convince everyone he was captaining a yacht. And there I was, the daughter he treated like a common clerk, silently acting as his shield by keeping my mouth shut during industry events so the banks wouldn't get spooked. The most infuriating part wasn't the lying. It was the sheer, reckless waste, the waste of it all. They were burning through their remaining capital to maintain a facade for people who didn't even like them. Richard would buy a new watch to impress a partner he was already planning to cheat, while Lillian would spend thousands on a charity gala dress, while the household staff's payroll checks were frequently delayed due to banking glitches. I felt a deep, cold sense of alienation as I sat there, picking at my organic salmon. I was the only one in the room who understood that the numbers on the page didn't match the lifestyle on display. Looking back now from my dark office, I realized that dinner was the last time I would ever play the role of the dutiful, silent daughter. I had spent years trying to gently guide them toward financial sanity, only to be met with Richard's arrogance and Lillian's feigned fragility. They viewed my expertise not as a gift to save them, but as a threat to their ego. They wanted the prestige of having a forensic accountant as a daughter, but they didn't want the accountability that came with it. They were living in a house of cards, and they had the audacity to be angry at me for pointing out the wind was picking up. The silence of my office was a sharp contrast to the hollow laughter of that Connecticut dining room. Richard's voicemail had finally stripped away the last of the gold leaf. He thought he was exiling me from a kingdom, but he was really just handing me the keys to the courtroom. I am no longer the protector of the Vance image. I am the auditor of the Vance reality. As I turned back to my computer, the memory of that suffocating dinner fueled my fingers as they moved across the keys. The gilded cage was about to be dismantled, piece by piece, starting with the very foundation of lies they had used to build it. The memory of that dinner was just another layer of dust on a foundation that had been rotting for over a decade. The first real crack, the one that shattered my naive belief in the sanctity of family, happened on my 21st birthday. While other girls in my circle were receiving designer bags or keys to new convertibles, I sat in my father's study, waiting for the paperwork for my tuition fund. It was the fund my grandfather had set aside for my graduate studies, a sum that represented my independence and the reward for years of hard work. I can still smell the expensive tobacco and old leather of that room, a scent that used to mean safety, but now only reminds me of a crime scene. Richard didn't even look up from his ledger when he delivered the news. He just tapped his gold fountain pen against the desk and said, with the casual indifference of a man discussing the weather, that the account was empty. "I had to reallocate those funds, Eleanor," he told me, his voice devoid of any apology. "The firm was facing a temporary liquidity crunch, and as a Vance, you have to understand that the family standing comes before your academic pursuits." I remember the room spinning, the weight of those words, his standing, crushing the future I had mapped out for myself. He hadn't asked, he hadn't even warned me. He had simply reached into my future and stolen it to pay for his present mistakes. When I tried to argue, pointing out that the money was a legal inheritance, he finally looked at me. His eyes were cold, reflecting that terrifying arrogance I've come to know so well. "Don't be selfish, Eleanor," he snapped, using that patronizing tone that makes you feel like a small child who doesn't understand the grown-up world. "Your sacrifice saved the family name. You should be proud to have contributed. Besides, you're smart enough to get a scholarship. Consider this a lesson in real-world economics. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, as they say." That was the moment I realized I wasn't his daughter. I was just a line item he could draw from whenever his own poor decisions caught up with him. I didn't cry. Even then, I had already begun to develop that silence of the abyss that would eventually become my professional armor. I walked out of that study and realized that the American dream my father preached about was, for him, a license to exploit the people closest to him. He valued the Vance name because of the doors it opened, but he didn't value the people who actually bore it. That was the year I changed my major to forensic accounting. I didn't want to just count money. I wanted to track it, to understand the mechanics of the lie, so that no one could ever take advantage of my hard work again. Looking back, that 21st birthday was my true graduation. I learned that in the Vance household, loyalty was a one-way street. I spent the next 13 years watching him do the same thing to others, always framing his greed as a necessity for the family. He used my mother's inheritance, he used my sister's trust, and eventually, he started using my professional reputation as a shield. He truly believed his own lies, that his success was inevitable, and that our sacrifices were his birthright. But tonight, as I look at the digital trail he tried to hide, I realize he forgot one thing. A lesson in real-world economics works both ways. He taught me how to be cold, how to be precise, and how to value the truth above sentiment. He wanted me to pull myself up by my bootstraps? Well, I've done that. And now, those boots are going to walk right over the empire he built on the backs of the people he claimed to love. The ledger of my life has been unbalanced for far too long, and it's time for the final reconciliation. If my father's theft of my tuition was a blunt force trauma, what my sister Vanessa did was a surgical strike. The kind of betrayal that leaves a scar you only feel when the weather turns cold. Vanessa, the golden child, the one who spent her days posing for social media and her nights spending our father's reallocated funds, had always viewed my career as a boring, secondary detail to the Vance family's glory. But 18 months ago, I discovered that she didn't just find my work boring, she found it useful. I was conducting a routine internal audit of a subsidiary when I saw it. My own professional license number, and my digital signature on a series of suspicious audit reports. My heart didn't race. It went cold. A professional reflex I had honed since I was 21. I tracked the digital footprint back to a laptop in the Greenwich estate, specifically to the guest room Vanessa used when she wasn't finding herself in Europe. She had stolen my professional credentials to help Richard bypass the verification checks for a bridge loan. She hadn't just lied. She had committed identity fraud against her own sister to protect our father's hollow empire. When I confronted her in the sunroom, she didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. She was sitting there, buffing her nails, surrounded by shopping bags from boutiques she couldn't afford. "Oh, Eleanor, don't be so dramatic," she had said, her voice dripping with a shallow, rehearsed annoyance. "Dad needed a signature, and you were being difficult with all your ethics talk. It's just a few numbers. You're so selfish, always worrying about your little license instead of helping your own family survive." That was the moment the last thread of family loyalty snapped in my soul. I realized then that to Richard and Vanessa, I wasn't a person. I was a tool, a resource to be mined until I was empty. Vanessa saw my years of study, my grueling exams, and my professional integrity as nothing more than a convenient shortcut for her next Chanel bag. She didn't care that her little signature could have landed me in prison or stripped me of the only thing I had built for myself without their help. The fury I felt wasn't hot. It was the kind of cold that preserves evidence. I didn't report her then. I was still foolish enough to believe I could fix the mess from the inside, to shield them one last time while I gathered my own exit strategy. But looking at my computer screen now, listening to that voicemail, I see how they interpreted my silence as weakness. They thought they had broken me into submission, that I would forever be the boring sister who kept the family secrets locked in a vault. Vanessa truly believed she had a right to my life's work because we shared the same bloodline. She, like Richard, forgot that blood only carries DNA. It doesn't carry a license to steal. They think they have discarded me tonight, but they have actually just removed the only person who was standing between them and a federal investigation. I am no longer the shield. I am the sword. The knife Vanessa put in my back, I've spent the last year sharpening it. The betrayal from Vanessa was a bitter pill, but as I continued to dig through the digital debris she had left behind, I unearthed a folder that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. It was labeled M. Vance, Long-Term Care Transition. My grandmother, Mary Vance, is 88 years old and the only person in that family who still possesses a shred of genuine dignity. She is the one who taught me that a person's word is their bond, a concept my father clearly viewed as an ancient, inconvenient myth. For the last 3 years, Grandma has lived at the Willows, a premier assisted living facility where she has her books, her garden, and the specialized medical care her heart condition requires. It is expensive, nearly $15,000 a month, but it was supposed to be covered by the ironclad trust my grandfather had established before he passed. As I opened the PDF documents inside that folder, the sheer depravity of my father's financial management became clear. Richard hadn't just been skimming from the trust. He had drafted a relocation agreement to move Grandma to a place called Green Valley Estates. I knew the name from a previous audit I had conducted for a state agency. Green Valley wasn't a valley, and it certainly wasn't green. It was a gray, crumbling facility located in an industrial zone, a place that had been cited multiple times for hygiene violations and inadequate staffing. It was a warehouse for the forgotten, costing a mere $2,000 a month. My father's plan was as simple as it was evil. By moving his own mother to this substandard dump, he could liquidate the surplus from her monthly care fund, over $13,000 every single month, to service the interest on his failing real estate empire. I sat there, staring at his digital signature on the transfer papers, dated for the end of this month. He was planning to pluck an 88-year-old woman out of the only home she had known since her husband died and dump her in a concrete box just so he could keep his country club membership for another season. It wasn't just a financial crime. It was a soul-crushing violation of the most basic human duty. In the world of forensic accounting, we talk a lot about fiduciary responsibility, the legal obligation to act in the best interest of another. My father had turned that responsibility into a hunting license. He was preying on the very woman who had given him everything. The irony was that Richard likely saw himself as a pragmatist. I could almost hear his voice in my head, explaining it away with that smooth, manipulative logic of his. She's old, Eleanor. She doesn't even know where she is half the time. Why waste all that money on a view when the firm is at stake? But I knew better. Grandma's mind is as sharp as a tack. She just chooses her words carefully, unlike the rest of the Vances. She had trusted him with her life, and he was treating her like an unwanted piece of furniture he could trade in for a quick buck. This discovery was the final drop that caused the cup of my patience to overflow. Before this, I was fighting for my own reputation and my own future. But now I was fighting for Mary Vance. This was the fatal point of no return for my father. In the circles he moves in, being a tough businessman is a badge of honor. But being a man who steals his mother's medical care to cover his gambling debts is a social death sentence. I felt a cold, professional rage settle over me, replacing the last remnants of daughterly hesitation. My father thinks he is a shark, but he has forgotten that I am the one who maps the waters. Numbers don't lie, but they do tell stories. And the story I was looking at was a tragedy that I was going to rewrite into a comedy of his errors. I began to download every single transaction record from Grandma's trust, cross-referencing them with the forged signatures Vanessa had provided. I wasn't just building a case anymore. I was building a cage. I spent the next 4 hours in that dark office, my fingers flying across the keys with the precision of a surgeon. By the time the sun began to peek over the Atlantic, I had enough evidence to strip Richard Vance of his power of attorney, his assets, and his pride. The discovery of the Grandma plot had changed the stakes of the game entirely. I wasn't just going to leave the family. I was going to dismantle the machinery they used to hurt people. I closed the laptop and took a deep breath, the air in the office finally feeling clean for the first time in years. Richard thinks he has discarded a prying daughter. He has no idea that he has actually unleashed a woman who has nothing left to lose and a grandmother's legacy to protect. The ledger is out of balance, and the audit has only just begun. The sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the skyscrapers of Hartford in shades of bruised purple and gold. But I didn't feel tired. I felt a cold, electric clarity that only comes when the numbers finally click into place. This was the awakening, the moment the victim transforms into the hunter. I turned my attention back to the primary weapon in my arsenal, the notice of revocation of professional identity authentication. In the world of high-stakes Connecticut real estate, my father's empire didn't run on cash. It ran on trust and verified signatures. By using my credentials, he had essentially been using my professional soul as collateral. I began to draft the legal notice, a document that would notify every major bank from Manhattan to Boston that any document bearing my seal from the last 18 months was officially contested and under forensic review. This was the most important part of my plan, the section designed to provide that intellectual satisfaction my father so desperately lacked. Every keystroke felt like a deliberate, surgical incision into his fraudulent facade. I spent the next several hours in a state of hyper-focus, what I like to call ASMR for the brain. I wasn't just compiling a list. I was building a cage out of data points. I meticulously gathered every piece of steel evidence, or what the younger generation calls the receipts. I cataloged the 36 instances where Vanessa had clumsily stolen my practitioner identification to sign off on bogus asset valuations. I documented the discrepancies between the actual liquidity in my grandmother's trust and the inflated figures Richard had presented to his creditors. I felt like an invisible observer, a phantom force moving through the digital corridors of their lives, seeing every lie they thought they had buried. My inner monologue was a steady, rhythmic chant. Numbers don't lie. People do. This wasn't about petty revenge. It was about the cold, hard restoration of justice. To pull this off, I had to play two roles. I had to be the Eleanor they expected, the quiet, slightly obsessive accountant who was too prying for her own good, but ultimately harmless, while secretly acting as a master strategist in the shadows. I even took a brief break to send a short, neutral text to my mother, Lillian, asking if she needed anything from the pharmacy. It was a calculated move to maintain the status quo, a perfect example of how I would want the fool to keep them off balance. While I typed that message, I was simultaneously authorizing a series of certified data holds on my father's primary development accounts. The contrast between my mundane outward actions and my internal gathering storm was exhilarating. I was acting in the darkness to bring everything into the light. The technical precision required for the suspension of identity authentication was immense. I had to ensure that when I triggered the notice, it wouldn't just flag the documents, it would freeze the entire transaction pipeline. This was the diction of expertise in action, using the very laws and regulations Richard thought were beneath him to bind his hands. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction as I cross-referenced the state statutes on forgery and elder financial abuse. Every time I found a new violation, I added a small victory to my list, a tiny burst of triumph that kept the momentum going. My father had spent 30 years teaching me that the Vance name was a shield. He was about to find out that a shield can also be a weight that pulls you under when the ship is sinking. By mid-morning, the formal suspension order was complete and sitting in my digital outbox, waiting for the precise moment of maximum impact. I had the steel evidence encrypted and backed up in 3 separate locations. My psychological state was no longer one of a betrayed daughter, but of a professional closer. The numbers were now my army, and they were perfectly aligned for battle. I looked at the clock. 10:15 in the morning. In less than 24 hours, the Friday morning trade window would open, and Richard would attempt to finalize his legacy deal. He thinks he has fired his only shield, but he has actually just cleared the way for his own executioner. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here. As a daughter, Eleanor is heartbroken. But as a professional, she is lethal. If you were in her shoes, would you protect your family's reputation or follow the truth? I'd love to read your thoughts below, and please hit that like button if you believe justice should always prevail. Friday morning arrived with a stillness that felt heavy with anticipation, like the breath a person takes right before a plunge into cold water. I arrived at my office at 7:45 a.m., the building still mostly empty, the hum of the ventilation system the only companion to my thoughts. This was the day Richard Vance expected to crown himself the king of Connecticut real estate, finalizing the $30 million deal that would, in his mind, erase his debts and cement his legacy. I sat at my desk, the same mahogany surface that had seen me protect him for years, and looked at the digital dossiers I had prepared. Each file was a receipt, a meticulous collection of every lie, every forged signature, and every penny stolen from my grandmother's trust. I felt a strange, cold calm, a professional silence of the abyss that meant the time for emotion had passed, and the time for execution had begun. At exactly 9 a.m., the hour when the compliance departments of the major banks began their morning briefings, I positioned my cursor over the send button. This was the notice of revocation of professional identity authentication I had crafted with such care, the diction of expertise that would turn my father's world upside down. With one click, I sent the reports to the senior auditors at First Connecticut Trust and the legal teams of his primary investors. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I felt a profound sense of release, as if a weight I had been carrying for 13 years had finally been dropped into the ocean. The truth is out of the bag, I whispered to the empty room. And for the first time in my life, I truly believed it. This wasn't an act of petty vengeance born of a daughter's hurt. I was doing this because numbers do not have feelings, and they do not tolerate being manipulated by men who think they are above the law. As the sent notifications pinged on my screen, I imagined the scene at the closing table in the opulent law offices downtown. Richard would be there, wearing his best charcoal suit, radiating that American dream confidence that had fooled so many people for so long. He would be sipping expensive espresso, perhaps making a joke at my expense to Vanessa, who would be sitting nearby, waiting for the deal to fund so she could go on her next shopping spree. He probably thought I was still at home, wallowing in the exile he had imposed via that cowardly voicemail, perhaps crying over the loss of my inheritance. He had no idea that while he was performing his role as the great patriarch, I had been performing my two roles, the silent, discarded daughter in public and the sharp-eyed forensic strategist in private. He had fired his shield, and in doing so, he had invited the light into the darkest corners of his business. The reports I sent were undeniable. I had provided the steel evidence of how he and Vanessa had clumsily stolen my practitioner credentials to verify non-existent assets for this very deal. I had included the bank statements showing the diversion of funds from my grandmother's medical trust to pay for his private club dues. I didn't need to scream or make a scene. The data would do the screaming for me. I was acting as the invisible observer, the ghost in his machine that had finally decided to speak the truth. In the culture of high finance, a notice of identity revocation is like a digital cardiac arrest. It stops everything instantly. Within the next hour, every account associated with the Vance Real Estate Group would be flagged for internal review, and the $30 million deal would evaporate like mist in the sun. I leaned back in my chair, watching the clock tick toward 10 a.m., the scheduled time for the signing. I could almost hear the ringing of the phones that was about to start. My father had spent his entire life believing that if you worked hard enough at the lie, it would eventually become the truth. He believed that he was entitled to success, that he was the hero of a story where everyone else was just a supporting character meant to be used and discarded. He forgot that the real American dream isn't about the gold leaf or the expensive suits. It's about the accountability that comes with power. As I sipped my cold coffee, I felt a grim satisfaction. I hadn't just protected my professional reputation. I had balanced the ledger for a woman who couldn't fight for herself, and for a daughter who was tired of being a tool. The Friday morning ritual was complete. The storm had broken, and there was no going back. The silence of my office didn't last long. At 10:15, the first vibration hummed against the mahogany, a sharp, frantic staccato that signaled the end of my father's piece. I didn't pick up. I simply watched the screen glow with Richard Vance's name, the light flickering like a dying star. Then came the second call, and the third, and the fourth. By 11 a.m., the phone was dancing across the desk, a relentless, rhythmic reminder of the chaos I had unleashed with a single digital signature. The 60 missed calls were a symphony of desperation, a numeric testament to the $30 million deal that was currently disintegrating in a boardroom downtown. I felt a deep, chilling sense of catharsis, the kind of gloating that only comes when the scales of justice finally begin to balance after 13 years of being weighted with lies. The messages began to flood in, a digital record of the 5 stages of grief performed by a man who thought he was a god. The first few were arrogant, his voice booming through the text as if he could still bully the world into submission. Eleanor, pick up this phone right now. There's been a banking glitch with your authentication. Fix it before the closing at noon. Don't be a child. Then came the confusion, the realization that the glitch was actually a surgical strike. The bank is saying my accounts are frozen. What did you tell them? Call me immediately. By noon, the tone shifted into a raw, ugly, a fury that stripped away the last of his Connecticut polish. He called me a traitor, a snake, a prying accountant who was destroying her own family out of spite. Vanessa's messages were even more desperate, though hers were flavored with the shallow vanity that defined her life. Eleanor, my cards are being declined at Bergdorf's. This is so embarrassing. Do you have any idea how this looks? Dad is losing his mind, and it's all your fault. Fix it. She didn't ask how I was, or why I had done it. She only cared about the sister's knife she had buried in my back, now being turned against her own credit limit. I read her words with the silence of the abyss, a calm so profound it felt like a physical weight. To them, I was still just a tool that had suddenly stopped working. They hadn't realized that the tool had become the architect of their ruin. As the 1 o'clock hour passed, the abusive messages turned into begging. Richard's voice in the voicemails was cracking, the booming authority replaced by a frantic, high-pitched plea. Eleanor, please, if this deal doesn't fund, we lose everything. The house, the cars, your mother's reputation. Think about what you're doing. We can talk about the trust. We can fix the clerical errors. Just call the bank and tell them it was a mistake. I listened to his desperation and felt nothing but the professional clarity of an auditor. He wasn't sorry for the theft or for the plan to dump his mother in a concrete box. He was only sorry that he had finally been caught by the person he thought he could control. I stood up and walked to the small vanity mirror in my office, ignoring the 61st vibration of the day. I didn't shout, and I wouldn't scream back. Instead, I followed the advice I would give to any woman in my position. I would whisper the truth through my actions. I picked up a tube of deep, classic red lipstick and began to apply it with the precision of a woman who had already won the war. I blotted my lips and looked at the reflection of the matriarch staring back at me. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the one who held the power. The accounts were frozen, the legal teams were mobilized, and the Vance name was currently being dragged through the compliance departments of every major financial institution in the Northeast. My father and sister were trapped in a storm of their own making, drowning in the 60 missed calls and the steel evidence I had provided. I smoothed my skirt and picked up my clutch, preparing for the charity gala that evening. It was time for the climax. the moment where the public image of Richard Vance would finally meet the forensic reality of his crimes. He thought he had fired his only shield, but as I walked out of the office, I knew I was heading toward his final curtain call. The ledger was almost balanced, and I intended to be there to witness the final reconciliation in person. The ballroom of the historic Greenwich Manor smelled of expensive lilies, aged scotch, and the distinct metallic scent of cold-blooded hypocrisy. It was the night of the annual Heritage Foundation Gala, an event where the American dream was on full display in the form of $5,000 tuxedos and diamond necklaces that could fund a small town's school district for a year. As I stepped out of the black car, the crisp night air felt like a final benediction. I caught my reflection in the glass doors. 34 years old, wearing a dress the color of midnight and that sharp, scarlet lipstick I had applied back in the office. I didn't look like a prying daughter or a discarded tool. I looked like an auditor, coming to collect a debt that had been overdue for 3 decades. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with gossip. The $30 million deal was the talk of the room, or rather, the sudden and mysterious banking glitch that had halted it at 11 o'clock that morning. I saw Richard Vance before he saw me. He was standing near the grand fountain, surrounded by a circle of high-tier investors, including Mr. Henderson, the man whose signature would have cemented my father's fraudulent legacy. Richard was performing. His gestures too wide, his face a shade of frantic red that no amount of expensive wine could hide. He was a man standing on a glass floor, trying to convince the world he was on solid ground. When our eyes met across the room, the laughter died in his throat. I watched the color drain from his face, replaced by a mixture of shock and a desperate, snarling arrogance. He excused himself from the group and marched toward me, his steps heavy with the weight of 60 missed calls and the crushing reality of a frozen bank account. "What are you doing here, Eleanor?" he hissed, his voice a low, jagged whisper meant to keep the socialites nearby from hearing the cracks in his armor. "You've done enough damage for one day. Get out before I have security remove you. This is a private event for people of standing, not for bitter children." I didn't flinch. I let the silence stretch between us, practicing that silence of the abyss that always made him more uncomfortable than any argument. I took a slow sip of sparkling water, watching him sweat under the crystal chandeliers. "Standing, Richard?" I asked, my voice calm and perfectly modulated for the room. "I'm just here to ensure the Heritage Foundation receives its promised donation. But from what I've seen on the ledger today, your standing is currently listed as a liability." He grabbed my arm, his fingers tight, but I didn't move. I simply looked down at his hand until he released me, the matriarch energy I had cultivated finally eclipsing his bullying presence. Mr. Henderson approached us then, his brow furrowed with a businessman's intuition. "Richard, there you are. My legal team is calling about some identity authentication issue. They say the primary auditor has revoked the verification seals on the whole development project." Richard turned to him, the fake smile snapping back onto his face like a mask. Oh, Arthur, just a minor clerical error. My daughter here was just explaining how she's going to fix it immediately. Right, Eleanor? The desperation in his eyes was pathetic. A man begging for a shield he had already thrown away. This was the moment of slow reveal, the catharsis I had prepared for since I found the folder on my grandmother's care. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I simply leaned in slightly so the investors could hear the diction of expertise that would end my father's career. I'm afraid my father is mistaken, Arthur, I said, my voice as sharp and cold as a winter morning. As the lead forensic accountant on record, I have issued a formal notice of revocation of professional identity authentication for every document associated with the Vance Group. The numbers don't lie, even when the signatures are imaginative. The circle of investors went deathly silent. Richard's jaw dropped, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I watched the realization hit him. The $30 million deal wasn't just delayed, it was dead. His reputation, his American dream, and his gilded cage were all dissolving in the light of the truth. You're destroying everything, he stammered, his arrogance finally collapsing into a hollow, shivering fear. I looked at him with the cold clarity of a woman who had finally balanced the ledger of my life. I'm not destroying anything, Richard, I whispered, the words intended only for him. I'm just conducting a final audit. And as it turns out, you're bankrupt in every way that matters. I turned and walked away, leaving him to face the questions of the men he had tried to swindle. I didn't look back to see him fall. I didn't need to. I had drawn the sword of the truth, and the showdown was over. As I moved toward the exit, I felt a surge of intellectual satisfaction, so deep it felt like rebirth. The climax was complete, and for the first time in 34 years, the Vance name belonged only to me. The weeks following the Heritage Foundation Gala were a blur of subpoenaed documents, freezing bank accounts, and the slow public disintegration of the Vance family name. Richard Vance, a man who once dictated the rhythm of Connecticut's elite, found himself drowning in a sea of litigation that even his most expensive lawyers couldn't navigate. The $30 million deal became the anchor that dragged him to the bottom of the ocean. But it was the systematic aftermath of my forensic reports that truly ended him. Federal investigators, prompted by my detailed Steele evidence, began to dismantle his firm piece by piece, discovering that the rot went far deeper than a few forged signatures. Watching the local news, I saw my father, once the picture of polished arrogance, hiding his face behind a briefcase as he entered the courthouse to face charges of grand larceny and elder financial abuse. He looked small, a man whose American dream had been revealed as a cheap, poorly constructed imitation. Vanessa's transition to the real world was perhaps the most spectacular part of the wreckage. Without our father's reallocated funds to cushion her existence, she was forced to face a reality she had spent 30 years ignoring. She lost the Greenwich guest suite, the designer wardrobe, and the social status she used to weaponize against me. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she is now working as a junior receptionist at a mid-sized law firm in a town where no one knows her former name. She is earning a salary that barely covers the interest on her credit card debt, discovering for the first time that a 9-to-5 job is the only way to pay for the life she once thought was her birthright. She tried to call me once, her voice still thick with that shallow, rehearsed entitlement, demanding that I fix things so she could move back into the gilded cage. I didn't even argue. I simply reminded her that my professional ethics are no longer up for negotiation. The most important part of the resolution, however, was Grandma Mary. The Monday after the gala, I didn't wait for Richard's permission or the lawyer's paperwork. I drove to the Willows, packed her belongings, and informed the management that I was now her legal guardian, backed by the evidence of Richard's plan to dump her in Green Valley Estates. Richard was in no position to fight me. He was too busy trying to keep his own head above water in bankruptcy court. I moved her into a small, sun-drenched cottage near my own home, a place where the air smells of pine, and the only transactions are the birds visiting her new garden. She is safe now, her medical trust restored and protected by the most ironclad forensic accountant in the state. Sometimes, as we sit on her porch with our tea, she catches my eye and gives me a small, knowing smile that says more than any audit report ever could. The mansion in Greenwich was auctioned off 3 months ago to pay back the victims of Richard's various schemes. I didn't go to the auction, as I didn't need a souvenir from a life built on lies. Instead, I spent that afternoon finalizing my own independent firm's first major contract. My reputation has never been stronger. In the wake of the Vance scandal, clients seek me out because they know I am the one who sees the truth behind the gold leaf. I am no longer the prying daughter or the boring accountant. I am the woman who balanced a legacy that was 3 decades out of alignment. My father and sister are now just footnotes in a case study, a cautionary tale about the cost of living beyond one's moral means. As the sun sets over my new office, I feel a sense of profound serenity that I never thought possible. The silence in this room is different from the silence of the abyss I used to use as armor. This is the silence of a job well done. I look at the framed photograph of Grandma on my desk, and for the first time in 34 years, I don't feel like I'm hiding something for someone else. I don't have to protect a man who would never protect me. I am Eleanor Vance, a woman of her own making, and my value is no longer determined by a father's fraudulent signature. The final audit is closed, the truth has been spoken, and the ledger is finally balanced. 1 year has passed since the night the Vance empire turned into a cautionary tale in the morning papers, and today, the only numbers I am interested in are the degrees on the thermometer and the minutes it takes for my tea to steep. I am sitting on the sun-drenched porch of my new home, a modest but sturdy, craftsman-style house that feels more like a sanctuary than the Greenwich estate ever did. Beside me, Grandma Mary is tucked into a handmade quilt, her eyes following the rhythmic dance of a hummingbird in the garden I planted for her. There is a profound, healing silence here, the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled with the noise of private jets or the hollow laughter of people who only love you for your credit limit. I look at my grandmother and see the peace I fought for, a peace that wasn't bought with forged signatures, but earned through the silence of the abyss and the courage to speak the truth. The American dream I grew up with was a distorted version of gold leaf and empty promises, a world where the facade was more valuable than the foundation. But as I sit here, watching the steam rise from my cup, I realize that the true dream is exactly this: the freedom to be self-reliant, the integrity to look at myself in the mirror, and the security of knowing that my success is built on my own hard work. I no longer have to be the invisible shield for a man who didn't deserve it. I am no longer a prying daughter or a tool to be depreciated. I am a woman who reclaimed her name by dismantling the lies attached to it. My forensic accounting firm is thriving, not because of the Vance legacy, but because people in this town have learned that my signature is the most honest thing they can buy. I think of Richard and Vanessa sometimes, but the fury has been replaced by a distant, clinical sense of pity. My father is living in a rented apartment 2 towns over, still trying to convince the local diner patrons that his grand comeback is just one deal away. He is a man who spent his life chasing a ghost, and in the end, the ghost was the only thing that stayed with him. Vanessa sends the occasional text, usually complaining about the bus schedule or the rudeness of her coworkers, but I have learned to read her messages like an old audit report, full of noise but lacking any real substance. They are still trapped in their own gilded cages of ego and entitlement, while I have stepped out into the light. I don't hate them. I simply don't have a place for them in a ledger that finally balances. This journey taught me that family loyalty is a two-way street, and that true legacy isn't about the money you leave behind, but the character of the person you leave it to. To the women who might be listening, those who have spent their lives as the quiet protectors of family secrets or the silent pillars of a crumbling home, I want you to know that it is never too late to conduct your own audit. You are not selfish for demanding the truth, and you are not prying for protecting your own worth. You are the matriarchs of your own lives, and your value is not a line item to be negotiated by men who don't understand the cost of your sacrifice. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of lavender and gold, I feel a deep, grounding sense of happiness. Happiness isn't a luxury item. It's the byproduct of living a life of integrity. I reached over and squeezed Grandma's hand, feeling the strength in her grip, a strength that my father never understood. I have traded the mahogany desk of my former office for this wooden porch, and I have never felt richer. The audit of my life is complete. The fraudulent entries have been erased, and for the first time in 34 years, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. I am Eleanor Vance, and I am finally free. My father once told me I was fired from the family. He didn't realize he was actually granting me my independence. The ledger is closed. The truth is my home. And as I look at the stars beginning to appear, I know that my best chapters are still being written. Watching Eleanor find her voice in a room full of powerful men reminded me that the truth is the most quiet but most powerful weapon we have. She didn't just save herself, she saved her dignity. The lesson here is simple. Never underestimate the person who knows how to count. And more importantly, family is built on respect, not just shared secrets. Your integrity is your only true inheritance. How did Eleanor's journey make you feel? Have you ever had to stand up for what's right against someone you loved? Share your story with us in the comments. I read every single one of them. Until next time, stay strong and stay true to yourself. Goodbye.